Welcome to today's webinar on introducing the Integrigy Security Framework for Oracle Business Suite. Let me introduce myself first. My name is Steve Coast. I'm the co-founder and chief technology officer of Integrigy. I've been working with Oracle products since 1994, and for the past 18 years, I've been focused on the security and auditing aspects of the Oracle Business Suite and the Oracle database. Today's topic is introducing the Integrigy Cybersecurity Framework for the Oracle Business Suite. This presentation has been about 15 years in the making. For those of you familiar with Integrigy, have been on our previous webinars and read our white papers, we publish out a lot of information related to Oracle Business Suite security. We publish out a number of frameworks in terms of the logging and auditing framework for the Oracle Business Suite, as well as one for the Oracle database. What we've done now is actually combined a lot of what we've been doing for our clients for the past 15 years in terms of doing security assessments and auditing projects, and rolled that up into a consolidated framework. There's other materials out there similar to this, but when we think about Oracle Business Suite security and compliance, we think about it holistically. How do you do this across the entire application in depth? And there's a number of aspects that need additional addressing that you need to dive into. So today we're going to walk through that. And this framework will actually be available via a couple of white papers in the next month or so. A little background about Integrigy. Integrigy is founded in 2002 by former Big Six consultants specializing in Oracle Business Suite. We were doing large projects at companies like Dell and GE helping implement Oracle Business Suite. Back then, security was not being handled. The app's password wasn't being changed from apps. We've come a long way from there, but still, this is a very complex, large application, and there's still a number of security issues with it. And that's what Integrigy does. We bring security to Oracle Business Suite. We do that several different ways. We have a set of products, one being AppSentry, which is a validation and auditing tool for Oracle Business Suite. Think about it as the secure configuration guide on steroids. It's really the tool that we use to implement our framework here. So we'll discuss a lot about the framework. AppSentry is one of those tools that helps us implement a lot of aspects of the framework. We also have a preventative, proactive layer of prevention for security for Oracle Business Suite called AppDefend. It's an enterprise application firewall, single sign-on, multi-factor authentication tool, and auditing and logging tool dedicated for Oracle Business Suite. If you aren't applying security patches immediately, this is the layer of virtual patching that will provide you the protection, the mitigation from missing security patches, as well as a number of attacks against Oracle Business Suite. This presentation today and our framework that we're really introducing here is really the culmination of a lot of our security assessments. So every day we're working with Oracle Business Suite customers how to secure their environment. How do you actually secure the application, the database, the application server? There's many aspects of that. We'll kind of talk about that throughout today, as well as how do you actually make sure it's compliant with the requirements that you have internally, be it SOX, PCI, HIPAA, GLBA, GDPR. How do you actually make sure that Oracle Business Suite is compliant? And then finally, we actually help a lot of our clients implement, based on requirements and design work, tools that work with Oracle Business Suite around security, like Oracle Transparent Data Encryption, Oracle Database Vault, third-party products like Imperva and Guardium. Finally, we're backed up by a world-class research team. So every day, our consultants and analysts are actually trying to break Oracle Business Suite. Most of the security vulnerabilities found in Oracle Business Suite were actually found by Integrigy. We work very closely with Oracle. We have a very good relationship with the Oracle Business Suite development team, and as well as being an Oracle Gold partner. So enough about Integrigy. Let's dive into the topic here. So what I'm going to do is talk about the security framework that we've developed at a high level, and then take a few areas of that framework, because it is fairly extensive and broad, and dive into them and talk about why you need a framework, why you need to get beyond just doing a simple checklist and things. The secure configuration guide for the Oracle Business Suite is a very good document. We should know because we actually wrote the original version for Oracle. It's changed a little bit over time, but it's basic. It's just a checklist. There's a couple other standards out there that are around Oracle Business Suite, but again, they're just more of a checklist. Hey, turn this knob, make sure that's setting. When we think about Oracle Business Suite security, we think about those things but taking it to another level in terms of how do you actually think about access management? How do you protect the data? How do you do development? There's many components to that. How do you do log management within Oracle Business Suite? So what I'll do is introduce the framework here and then actually dive in a couple areas and show you kind of why this is a unique framework for Oracle Business Suite and how it takes you to the next level in securing the environment by not just looking at a simple checklist items on, oh, I need to secure this password, I need to apply a patch and things like that, but truly think about the application top to bottom, how you actually operate, maintain it, use it every single day in order to make it secure. Some of the significant challenges around the Oracle Business Suite is mostly it's a highly complex application with a very difficult to run technology stack. Because not only you're talking about one of the world's largest web applications, you're talking about one of the most complex database structures in the world, as well as then layering on a web application with a web application server on top of it. It's not well understood by IT security. We see a huge misconnect in the organization that the Oracle Business Suite team's doing a good job. They're kind of running and keeping it up to date. However, the IT security team just doesn't understand it. They're not database experts. They're not Oracle Business Suite experts. So there's kind of a gap there between security and Oracle Business Suite. And even if IT security has some focus on it, they're not experts in package applications or databases. So they're missing the expertise to do it. And that's why the framework is very important, where in some other areas in the organization, you're probably doing very well in IT security. What we see in most organizations is that e-business suite is kind of an orphan stepchild. It's there, people may be addressing it. And even when we talk to some organizations that think they're doing a really good job on Oracle Business Suite security, when we kind of dive into it, they're kind of doing it cursory. IT security, no, we looked at it and we thought it was great. However, when you get into the details, there's a lot of warts behind the scenes with Oracle Business Suite. And so unless you understand Oracle Business Suite or are guided, such as using the framework here, you can miss things. When we think about Oracle Business Suite, we think about a database, an application server, as well as the application itself. Each technology stack is unique. When you secure a database, that's problematic enough. Then you have to secure Oracle Business Suite, as well as you may have either Oracle Application Server if you're running 12.1, or if you're running 12.2, you'll have WebLogic. Each of those have their own security requirements, but then also you have to sit back and say, okay, for this Oracle database, it's not just an Oracle database, it's an Oracle database hosting Oracle Business Suite. So that becomes very important. So when I try to secure it, I can't use every single tool in my toolbox that works with a typical Oracle database, because Oracle Business Suite is unique. There's certain things I can do, certain things I can't do. Oracle Business Suite tends not to live well with the IT security ecosystem. So IT security already has their tools and processes in place. However, a lot of times those tools and processes don't work well with Oracle Business Suite, or have to kind of be modified a little bit to work with Oracle Business Suite. So again, we're providing a structure here to say, okay, what can you do with those security tools? When we talk about centralized logging, you may have a tool like Splunk in place. Yes, you can send the alerts there, but you need to spend a little bit of time doing that. And then finally, customizations in Oracle Business Suite are very different than your typical application development. When you're thinking about your classic application development, you're thinking about, I start with a big application, I start from scratch and I kind of develop it, and then I do maintenance on it. Well, Oracle Business Suite is kind of pinpoint development. I develop an interface, I develop a report, I develop a custom web page. It's 1,000 little pricks of development versus doing one full bore project. Therefore, security vulnerabilities can be introduced in any one of those customizations. When we start talking about customizations, we were just working with a client that had 450 different Oracle Business Suite customizations. Each of those could be, you could think about as a separate small development project. They're all separately managed. They all had their own kind of codes and things like that. And so we're every single one of those gone through the appropriate security checks, validations that to make sure that there wasn't a security vulnerability incorporated. So these are the things when we think about Oracle Business Suite, some of the problems and challenges. Therefore, when we designed the framework, we really had to address these and try to make sure it works both with Oracle Business Suite as well as with the security ecosystem that you're working within. So one of our goals was to base this off something, not to start from scratch. So what are some of the good references? So the National Institute of Standards and Technology does have a cybersecurity framework that's used by many enterprises. It's well used within the US government. So we used the NIST cybersecurity framework as a starting point. So we kind of based everything we were doing off. We wanted to make sure we had a full coverage. We wanted to cover everything that we had to cover within Oracle Business Suite. What are all the processes, all the policies and procedures that need to be addressed? And things like just governance of cybersecurity risk. How are you addressing cybersecurity? How are you approaching access management? Are you doing training and awareness? How do you detect security vulnerabilities in the environment? And then finally, an area that we actually noticed that most organizations weren't handling well, and we always ask the classic question to the DBA. So if you do discover a breach, what are you going to do? If you signed in, like a Blue Cross Blue Shield database administrator did a couple of years ago, and saw that they were already signed into the database, what are you going to do? That, hey, that's a malicious person who's actually using my credentials. How did they get in there? What am I going to do? Where's my first call? Am I going to immediately bounce the database, or am I going to try to keep the database up to potentially preserve forensics? Who am I going to call? Is it IT security? Do I call the IT security help desk? It was very interesting in that we've never had a good response from a DBA when we asked those questions. So therefore, we've actually included how do you respond to a security breach or incident within the framework. And the NIST framework walked through 5 major areas. We removed one, which was recover. How do you actually recover from an Oracle Business Suite security event? But really the 4 areas that we focus in on are identify, which you can think of the governance. These are the policies and procedures. These are how I've actually designed the processes that operate around Oracle Business Suite. Protect is that active layer of protection, access management, data security, things like that. Detection is actually how do I detect if there's a security issue? How do I detect that there's fraud in the environment? And then finally, the last one, which is kind of the smallest piece of the overall framework, but how do I actually respond? Do I have a response plan in place? How do I actually analyze and mitigate immediately this issue? Do I have a document that I can immediately jump to that says, I may not want to bounce the database because I may lose the forensic, but I may want to immediately turn on auditing on that user, something like that. So this is the cybersecurity framework as NIST. And so what we've done is taken this framework and used it as the base for the framework for Oracle Business Suite. We had to customize it because, again, most of the high-level frameworks out there are meant for an enterprise. How do I address the entire enterprise? We're addressing a subset of the enterprise. We're addressing the Oracle Business Suite environment, which may be, in some organizations, if it's your key application that's also doing manufacturing, it may be 25, 30% of your overall IT. So therefore, it's meaningful. So we try to address as much as we can, have as much breadth as we can in the Integrigy Security Framework. What we're addressing with the framework is really the people, processes, and technology. Not only that checklist, but we're going way above and beyond that. We're looking at everything within Oracle Business Suite. How do you configure it? How do you secure it? How do you monitor it? And all those processes, how do you customize it, everything that you need to do with Oracle Business Suite on a daily basis. And what we've tried to do as much as possible is align it with your internal security standards. So when we talk about is our privacy policy, how do you integrate with that privacy policy? That's important to how you actually end up at the end of the day doing things like data protection. 4 key areas was enterprise risk and compliance. How does this fit into the overall risk program of the organization, as well as identifying those risks specific to Oracle Business Suite? When we talk about risk within Oracle Business Suite, we're talking about not only just fraud in the application, the typical things like an internal auditor would talk about, but we're talking about, is it on the internet? If you're running iSupply, iStore, iRecruitment, or one of the other modules on the internet, your risk is very different than if it's just an internal application. So those are the types of things that you need to address when you're talking about risk in the Oracle Business Suite. Just general cybersecurity controls in the application. Is it secure? Am I applying patches? How do I do identity and access governance in terms of around access management? Who can connect? But when we think about who can connect, I'm not only talking about the application, I'm talking about the database, the application server, because again, within an Oracle Business Suite environment, I've got 3 layers of authentication going on. And then we'll kind of break that down even further to show you the problems and why you need a framework to address. Here's all the potential issues, not just, hey, we did a segregation of duties analysis on our application users and everything was great. But if someone can go in the database back end and just update any transaction they want, all your application security controls are worthless. So that's what we're trying to address, not only in the front end, but also in the back end of the application. How do you do data protection? So do you have sensitive data in the application? Do you have social security numbers, credit card numbers? HIPAA information, those types of things. And in order to make sure the framework was complete, we've mapped it to most of the controls frameworks out there. So again, starting with the NIST Cybersecurity Framework is what we base it off of, but there's ISO 27001, 27002, which are kind of the standard best practices around security. The internal auditors are mostly familiar with COBIT. So again, another layer of controls. The Center for Internet Security has the critical security controls. That's a number of controls meant for critical infrastructure systems. The Cloud Security Alliance has the top 20 security controls for ERPs when they're running in the cloud. Again, those are very useful controls because most of the organizations running in the cloud are doing it infrastructure as a service, so it's very similar to actually running it on premise. And then finally, Oracle Business Suite is a web application. So we actually even use the OWASP, which is the Open Web Application Security Project, Application Security Verification Standard, which is meant for if you're doing a custom application, but it's got very good points in how I should configure some of these minor items within the application to make sure that as a web application, Oracle Business Suite is secure. And so then we mapped it out. We made a couple changes here at the high level. So we changed identify to governance, because that made a little bit more sense. But we did keep protect, detect, and respond, and then kind of change these slightly to really starting to address an Oracle Business Suite environment. What's important in Oracle Business Suite environment? So from a governance perspective, how are you doing things like change management? How are you doing development? Even service provider management. You may be outsourced. This may be in the cloud. You may have outsourced DBAs. So those are service providers. How is the supply chain risk in terms of you may have 2 or 3 additional third-party products. You may be using Vertex for tax management. You may be using a few other things like export reports to Excel. How are you handling those additions into Oracle Business Suite? Are those being done securely? Are you sure those are secure? Under Protect, the big one is access management. But again, secure configuration. How am I protecting sensitive data? Things like that. Detection is fairly significant. Oracle Business Suite's got very good logging, but are you doing enough of it? Are you capturing it where it should be? And finally, how do you respond to a security incident if it does occur? I won't break all these out. What we're going to do is take a couple of these and dive into detail, kind of discuss them and kind of show you why the framework is so important. Before I do that, let's take one of them. I'll take the protect item. One of the key aspects is when you think about an Oracle Business Suite environment, you're not securing Oracle Business Suite. You're securing Oracle Business Suite as an application. You're securing an Oracle database running Oracle Business Suite application. You're securing an application server that's running Oracle Business Suite as one of the world's largest web applications. It's got over 20,000 web pages. The thing is a monster. And then finally, there's even OS and network security issues. Most of those are general. Most of those should be handled for any application you're deploying. However, Oracle Business Suite has some very specific issues, risks, warts in the application that you need to address. And those are typically addressed at the OS and network layer. And so again, what we've done is broken this out and kind of to show you that, hey, across each of these, it'll change. When I talk about access management, I'm talking about access management 4 different places. I'm talking about the application users. I'm talking about the database users. Oh, by the way, if you're running 12.2, you even have users at the WebLogic layer. I sign into the WebLogic console. I can actually create additional users. Not typically done, but at least I have one account there I need to change the password of. I've got OS security issues because, again, Oracle Business Suite is running the Oracle and Apple Manager accounts. How are you securing those? Can anybody go into those accounts? How would you actually protect the password and things like that? So I won't go through all these, but again, you get a flavor for I'm doing different things at different layers of the stack. And when we talk about our framework here, we're talking about doing each of these aspects, but then times 4, because we're breaking it out across each layer of the technology stack. Sometimes they're very similar, sometimes they're very different. So what we'll do is kind of talk about breaking one of these out. And hopefully the goal of this presentation is you get a little bit different feeling for the application. You kind of think about it differently, not that, oh, I just need to go fix some default passwords. What we're trying to do is show you how you need to think through the process start to finish and make sure that you're covering everything, because oftentimes people aren't, or when we talk to internal auditors and we actually give these presentations to internal auditors, like, oh, we didn't know Oracle Business Suite could do that. Or, oh, we've never looked at that before. Is that an issue? It absolutely is an issue. We've actually done this for some internal auditors, and they had some major findings on the applications when they actually said, oh yeah, we actually looked at that now, and yes, they were completely doing it wrong, and there was unfettered access in certain areas of the application. So the first thing is to step back and talk about access management at a very high level. And what we do is first is we always categorize the users. We break this out at the different layers and talk about what needs to be done, because user populations and different groupings of users will have different policies, procedures, and access management risks. First and foremost, when we talk about the application users themselves, these are the people who sign into the application from the front end. I actually have 4 user populations. When we present this to internal auditors, they're like, wow, that actually makes a lot of sense. We've never thought about it that way. We've always just been focused in on like the segregation of duties of our users. But you've got the internal named users. Those are your employees, your contractors who either are on site or remote in via the VPN. They may be defined locally or externally. If you're externally defined, you're using SSO. That provides a very good solution. And then we look at SSO as a solution, because then again, if someone's terminated in the organization, they're immediately terminated in Oracle Business Suite. But you have another group of users within that user population that's stored in FND user, and those may be the external users. So if you're running iSupply or iStore, iRecruitment, your suppliers, customers, candidates, that's a different user population because there's a different risk there. Those users are not under your own control. How do you know that your suppliers aren't just have one account and everyone's sharing that? Isn't that an appropriate risk? How does that work? I may want a little bit tighter controls over my suppliers because, hey, if someone gets into a supplier account, they may be able to see things that I don't want them to see. They may want to know what are you buying, how much you're paying for it. Customers may be similar with price lists and things. Where candidates, I may not care as much. I may just, if candidates can submit a resume through our recruitment, that may be good enough. I may not need like a multi-factor authentication on my candidates, but maybe on my supplier users I do. So throughout the framework, we address this, looking at these different user populations and address, here's the solutions, here's what we need to be looking at in terms of risk. Another one in Oracle Business Suite is when you install the application, you get 30 generic accounts by default. Most of these are privileged and have default passwords. As part of the secure configuration guide, you should be end dating and change the passwords for these. However, accounts like sysadmin and guest are different. Sysadmin and guest are always required. Fortunately, the guest account is very limited. There's not issues, especially if you're running newer versions of 12.2. But the sysadmin user has to be enabled. You cannot disable that. And by the way, the DBAs need to use it for some management functions sometimes. So it has to be actively used. How are you actually controlling that? How are you controlling the password and things like that? Then are you making sure those other 28 different accounts are actually end dated and the passwords are changed? Do you have a check for that? And it even gets worse, because if you do an upgrade, let's say you're on 12.1.3 today and you do an upgrade to 12.2.10, by the way, a few more seated users show up and Oracle does not include that in the documentation. And by the way, depending on how you do the upgrade, those may actually be active. Are you checking for these seeded accounts to make sure that they're actually have been end dated and passwords changed? Because a few more may show up when you actually do an upgrade to Oracle Business Suite 12.2.10. And then finally, the one that has most of the compliance issues in organizations, and often the internal auditors aren't looking at, is there's generic accounts that are created for your organization to manage concurrent manager jobs and sometimes a few other application functions. Because the problem with concurrent manager jobs is you can schedule them, but if you schedule them under the named user and that person leaves and you end date their account, all those jobs stop working. So many organizations want to manage those under a central account, and it's very difficult to manage those accounts. Are your internal auditors aware that there's some generic accounts that have some privileges that can schedule concurrent manager jobs? And these may be GL posting jobs. Those are SOX significant jobs. How are you managing those? Like for our App Defend product, we have a special solution to manage those that allow you to do multi-factor authentication and tie those generic accounts to named users. Becomes a very effective control. But are you looking at? And these are the things that we're talking about in the framework. Here's a list of the seeded generic accounts. I won't go into this in detail, but this kind of gives you a list of some of the privileges. So again, System administrator shows up on this list quite a bit. So are you checking this? Do you have a control in place to make sure that these accounts are not being activated by someone unactively used? So that was at the application layer. And the problem with Oracle Business Suite is when we talk about it, we're talking about not only the application, but we have a lot of access to the database layer too. And the database accounts, just like the application accounts, are not all created equal. So I've got a couple different classes. On the left side, I've got the Oracle accounts that are created. And your DBAs are actively using the system accounts. Those have to be used in Oracle Business Suite. Oh, by the way, Oracle Business Suite 12.2, the newer versions actually have a mitigating control around that where I can actually I can do the system account migration that removes the requirement to actually use the system account for patching and things. That makes my application more secure. So have you looked at that? Are you aware of that change in 12.2? For the interactive accounts, that's the apps account. The data owners are the accounts like GL. Have you changed the passwords? Do you know when someone's actually using the apps account that's outside of the application? But again, the DBAs need to do that. And how do I actually track that within my auditing and logging? But have you looked at all your interface accounts? So what other accounts are connecting to the database using service accounts, and are those privileges limited in things? And then finally, on user accounts, the DBAs are connecting. Do they have their own named accounts? So when they're just looking at the application and they're not actually changing something, are they using the apps account? Are they using named accounts? Do you have a number of ad hoc accounts? Are those accounts that are generic, like read only and have unlimited access to read anything in the database? Is that appropriate for the organization? So these are the things you need to be looking at and thinking about when you're looking at the application. So when we look at the framework and we do our security assessments, we take all the accounts and break them out and have discussions around these categories versus saying, oh, how are you doing database account management? Database account management is going to change by the type of account. I don't need to be rotating my passwords for the middle column every 90 days. That becomes very problematic in many organizations, but for my users, I may want to be rotating those every 90 days. Or I want to be hooking the column to the right up to Active Directory, so then if someone's terminated, they're automatically terminating the database too. One of the key risks in Oracle Business Suite is there's a lot of generic privileged accounts. So when we look at the application layer, I've got the sysadmin account. When I'm looking at the database layer, I've got the apps and system account are actively used. And even at the operating system, I've got the Oracle and Apple Manager. All these different layers, how I control the access to these, how I get the information to know who's named users and things becomes very important. So I need to be looking at all this in detail. And why is this such an issue? One is any one of those accounts can potentially do something. The problem is there's inherent flaws in Oracle Business Suite. If I get one of those generic accounts, I have all those generic accounts on that list. So from any one of those accounts, I can actually find a way to compromise and get into every other generic privileged account. So if I log in as sysadmin, I can actually execute SQL as the apps user. So certain things like Oracle alerts and other SQL functions within the application that I go into the application front end, I can, in certain functions, insert SQL statements that will execute as in the database, and those will execute as the apps, which will actually fundamentally allow me to take over and use the apps account. If I go in as the apps account, I actually can execute SQL as a sys user, which allows me to take over things, or I can actually change the sysadmin password or actually manipulate the sysadmin account so I can gain access to it. If I have access to the Oracle account, which owns the database, again, I can do anything I want in the application as the apps. So there's a lot of interdependency. So if one person has one of these accounts, you have to really assume that they have all of them. Are you addressing that appropriately? That's kind of the things that the framework looks at, is how is access to each of these. And we break it out specifically. How are you controlling access to the apps account? How are you controlling access to the sysadmin account? All of these accounts are very important to the application overall. And when we talk about access management, we're talking about a large number of pieces there, all the way from how I provision the account, how does it get authorized in the application, to segregation of duties, how do I do password changes, how do I do account locking and things like that, and then finally, how do I actually deprovision these accounts? One of the biggest issues we see in Oracle databases is that Oracle database accounts are created but never terminated. Because what happens is you may terminate the person in Active Directory, they may be terminated at enterprise level, but does that notification really go to the DBA to say, hey, this person is in this database and they need to be terminated? The problem with Oracle databases is typically accounts are decentralized. You create accounts in each database and they're managed locally in that database. There's no central repository of those accounts. There's no connection to Active Directory unless you specifically set that up, which takes a little bit of effort to do. But again, it's a very effective control. I won't go in detail each of these, but as part of the presentation we're going to send out, we actually have a lot of the detail behind it. So as you can see, we talk about each of these in detail, talk about example controls. And then we take it even to the next level. So when we talk about the framework, we're actually trying to then map this out. And as you can see, this is an example from an actual client that we actually went through, and each of those categories of database accounts, then we mapped it to all the different processes. And as you can see, it changes based on the type of account. So sometimes I'm doing local authentication. This client really wanted to hook up the Oracle database to Active Directory, but you can't hook up the Oracle database to Active Directory for all accounts. You can only do it for those named accounts. You can't do it for the service accounts, the apps account, and Oracle Business Suite and things. So again, the controls changed. So how do you actually control access to the apps account? Is that in a password vault? Those types of things. So when we map this out, we talk about different accounts and how do you actually control each account. So that's access management at a high level. And again, the purpose is to give you a different idea on how to look at it. How do you look at access management versus just saying, oh, controlling a few passwords and things like that, that passwords need to expire in 90 days. As you notice, we didn't even talk about that. That's like one item on a longer list of items is, okay, passwords are changed every 90 days and accounts are end dated after being stale. But there's many other aspects of that. And when you start thinking about both service accounts as well as named accounts, you have to think about it differently because the way you manage each of those sets of accounts changes dramatically. The next topic I'm going to do a little bit more deep dive is sensitive data protection. So as you can see from the previous section, we talked about there's even a mini framework within access management. The same thing will happen with sensitive data. So first and foremost, what's sensitive data at a very high level? So we talk about PCI, which is credit card numbers. We may have privacy regulations around things like social security numbers, credit card numbers, and bank account numbers. You may have some HIPAA data. We've got one client who's actually a medical device manufacturer. They ship things directly to their clients, so their accounts receivable system is actually under HIPAA. Kind of a very interesting case study for them. But again, what information do you have in your Oracle Business Suite? So the first and foremost, you have to understand, what am I trying to protect? When I talk about sensitive data protection, I've got a couple different layers there. First and foremost, I've got this important information, this personally identifiable information that I need to protect. But you may get down to, hey, our price list is very sensitive. If someone got hold of our price list, it would damage our business. So if someone compromised your Oracle Business Suite and database and got all the data, who could use that data? And that's part of the risk analysis. So the first step of securing Oracle Business Suite is having that risk analysis to say, who would be the threat actors? Would it be a competitor? If a competitor got our price list, would that damage the business? Those types of things. If someone got into the bank account information, could they do electronic funds transfers and things like that? So that when we're talking about sensitive data, that's what we're talking about. Most people think about it as personally identifiable information that where breach notification laws would take place. But again, you need to take it beyond that. So just assume that someone compromises your entire Oracle Business Suite environment. Think about who might that be and what could they use the data for? And that tends to be a little bit of a brainstorming with kind of the business owners to say, hey, who would want this data? What would it be used for? The next aspect of Oracle Business Suite is, where is the sensitive data? How do I need to protect it? And again, it may be in the standard Oracle Business Suite table. So for employee information, it's PR, employee, all. In other tables, it may be in custom tables. It may be in maintenance tables. So one of the things the DBAs love to do is, hey, Oracle's told me to do a direct SQL update to PR all people F table. What's the first thing I'm going to do? I'm going to do create table as select and create a backup of that just in case. Well, now I've got 2 copies of all the HR data within my Oracle Business Suite environment. That includes those security numbers. Do you know where that is? So when I do my scrambling and cloning, am I including that? I may have interface tables that are accepting credit cards, or I may be processing Blue Cross Blue Shield data, something like that. We've even found sensitive data in flex fields. So again, there may be somewhere where they need to store some information like social security number, and hey, Flex fields are great for that, so we'll just store it in the flex field because that's just a very easy to configure field in the application. And then finally, it may be even in the operating system because, again, these batch files are coming back and forth for interfaces, and I may be writing in and out to my healthcare provider and sending them the insurance information, which may include social security numbers, and I'm writing it out to a file, FTPing it, or something else securely. It may even be in log files. We've found a couple cases where people are running Oracle payments, someone turned on debugging, and by the way, all the very sensitive credit card data is written to the Oracle payments debug files. And if you turn on full debugging, you get everything. You get the full credit card transaction, including the secret little 3-digit code on the back. So when we think about sensitive data protection, again, it's not just turning on transparent data encryption. That's just one aspect. So when we think about the framework here, sensitive data protection has a process within that. So we start all the way back at the enterprise data privacy policy. What data elements are considered private? What need to be protected? And trying to get that down to the data element level. A lot of organizations don't have that. And this is, again, where another misconnect, and what we're trying to address with the framework is trying to bring that together and say, the DBAs don't know when you say, oh, we need to secure PII data. They don't know what's personally identifiable information in the database. And that's what the standard says. I've read more than enough data protection policies at an enterprise level and just says, oh, we need to protect employee data. We need to protect customer data. That's as low as they go. The DBA needs to know its first name, last name, date of birth, address, driver's license number, or whatever it might be. Then the other case is, oh, we just need to protect everything that's employee data, and they list out like every possible field. That's not effective either because there's just too many fields. It's too much data. A lot of cases they say, oh, all of HR is private data because every single table has either salary information or tax calculations or something, so you can derive salary from it. And that becomes very difficult for the DBA. So it becomes a dancing act, and we try to address this to say, okay, let's get down to the data element level. And then you need that data inventory. You need to get down to the table column level. So you need to say date of birth is in these tables. Then the question is, what protection does it need? So a lot of inventories don't get to that third step. So you need to know it's date of birth, it's in these table and columns, but what do I do about it? What do I need to restrict access? Does it need to be encrypted or whatever? What do I need? Oh, we need just all that. Everything needs to be protected. The problem is for the DBAs, they can't do that. So that's why we kind of address a lot of this in the protection process as going step by step and making sure that everything is lined up. And then the solutions here, there may not be one solution. Within Oracle Business Suite, this is a 1986 application. The fundamental data design of Oracle Business Suite was done in 1986, and it hasn't changed much. The web front end has. It's a nice slick web front end now, but the back end data model hasn't changed, and there's a lot of issues around that. Oracle's got very limited native encryption in the application. It can do credit card numbers and bank account numbers, but that's it. If you do transparent data encryption, that adds another layer, but that's not complete. Once someone signs in the database, they're not getting it. Is that good enough? How about if when I'm sending this across the network? When we talk about network encryption, you have to remember you've got from the browser to the application server, and then from the application server to the database. But then I might also have a dozen other connections coming into the database from reporting tools, backup and recovery tools, management tools, things like that. Are all those encrypted appropriately? And then finally, I may have to use access controls and auditing, make sure that someone doesn't have access to this, make sure that if someone does access it, it is audited. And then finally, when we're talking about maybe even cloning it, am I actually masking, redacting this, or scrambling it when I'm actually sending it to a data warehouse, or actually when I'm doing cloning the test and development? So all these pieces need to work together, and that's why we put together a framework, because a lot of places are like, oh, we just need to turn on transparent data encryption, but they're not looking at why we need to do that. Is that enough for the data? For all these data elements, does somebody even have access to it? Because transparent data encryption is a great tool. If I lose a disk drive, a backup tape, it is encrypted. However, the second someone signs on a database, it's not encrypted. So one of the key risks here, and throughout this presentation, we're just going to highlight the framework. Again, is very extensive. We've been doing this for 15 years, have many components. If you look through our previous white papers and presentations, you'll see components of And what we're doing now is bringing it all together into a well thought out, complete framework across the board. So one of the areas that we often see is test and development and Oracle Business Suite cloning. A lot of people aren't used to, if they're not, haven't worked with Oracle Business Suite. Most applications, you actually take development and copy it to test, and then you copy it to production. That's how you get code into production. Very few other applications, you actually take production and actually copy the entire thing of production down to test and development on a regular basis. That's not typical for most organizations, especially for custom applications. For package applications, is a little bit more common. But what you're doing in a Oracle Business Suite environment is I'm taking production with all that sensitive data and copying it down to test and development. Then I'm potentially, even during testing, I'm actually loading into test and development. We often see that, hey, people are doing a great job on scrambling sensitive data when they're cloning from production to test. But, oh, by the way, the developers always need to work with live data in their minds. So they're loading in live production data into test and development without anyone's authorization or knowledge of it. And so, again, the data, not all the data is there, but some elements of the data are there. So again, when we talk about the framework, we're trying to address all these different issues across the board and make sure that you've completely covered all the potential risks in the environment from different perspectives. Sensitive data discovery is something that's often not done in Oracle Business Suite. And there's a number of tools out there. So Oracle provides a free tool called DBSat Discover, which will actually do some data discovery. If you're running Oracle Enterprise Manager, the Quality Management Pack has data discovery capabilities. The Oracle Cloud Data Safe has data discovery capabilities. So if you're at Oracle Cloud, you can use that. Our AppSentry product has sensitive data discovery. And again, to find sensitive data is not a simple process. Everyone's like, oh, no, you just kind of look. There's a number of steps to it, and the level that you go to gives you the quality of the output. Best case scenario, you're crawling table by table, because again, if you have social security numbers in a flex field, unless someone tells you about that, it's very difficult to find unless you're crawling through the database looking for that pattern in that format. Most people just say, hey, we've got Oracle Business Suite, so we know in P are all people F is national identifier, so that's national identifiers, which includes social security numbers. That's our set of locations. That's not good enough. Well, then they may do a data dictionary analysis, so I may look for SSN, credit card number, national identifier, table and column names, as well as the comments. Well, that's may not be good enough because it may be in a flex field. It may be in a custom table that's got really weird naming to it. And then like our tool will then take the data qualification next step, and we'll actually do pattern analysis against that. And again, social security numbers are 9-digit numbers. You may have a lot of 9-digit numbers. So you can actually remove false positives by actually looking through the data within that column and say, hey, there's some 9-digit numbers, but there's a whole lot that aren't, so probably not social security numbers. And then you can actually do another step to actually quantify that data. And actually, like credit card numbers, you can do the checksum on those and actually get a very high level of confidence. So when we talk about privilege access and sensitive data, this is kind of what you get to at the end of the day, is you start looking through, at least at the database level, how is access controlled, what privileges do they have, and how do I actually audit that? So you're looking for the gaps, because I may not be able to audit the data because there's just too much data access. I may not be able to encrypt it completely because the application doesn't do it. And I may have done Oracle TD, but again, once somebody logs in, Oracle TD doesn't do anything for you because it's decrypted once I'm logged into the database automatically. So I may have to actually do some of this access and privilege analysis. And this is, again, another example of looking through all those different accounts and how are you controlling it? Are you reviewing privileges on a periodic basis? Are these fixed? Do I have actually auditing? What layer of auditing can I turn on? Who's got the password for these accounts and things like that? So then again, I can now take it to a data protection layer also and talk about threats. And then what are my solutions for those threats? So this matrix here goes through all the different threats. So who can access the data by either signing in the database or getting a backup tape or exploiting a security vulnerability? And then which of my solutions that I'm putting in place actually protect the data at that layer? We've had a lot of clients who are actually very surprised at the end of the day when we did this analysis for them and actually walked through the threats versus how things are actually being done. And they were actually surprised that they had some significant gaps in that they had no auditing, they had no access control, or they had no encryption on certain data elements that they thought, hey, oh, that's protected because we've got transparent data encryption enabled. Again, it's not, that may not be the perfect solution. You may have to add things on top of it. So this next section I'm going to dive through fairly quickly, but give you a very high-level feel. One of the buzzwords now is called DevSecOps, which is taking development operations, DevOps, and adding security into it. And the idea here is I'm moving security earlier into the process. I'm moving security into my actually software development, my customization development here, very early in the process. So I'm actually catching security vulnerabilities before they make it to production, because I don't want to have to catch them during penetration tests or actually someone hacking in. I want to catch it early on. And that's the concept around DevSecOps. This could be called secure development, but we're using the term that a lot of the industry is using now called DevSecOps. So and it's called shift left. I'm trying to include security earlier in on my process. And the problem with Oracle Business Suite is it's a big application with lots of different customizations and extensions written in multiple languages. And I've got a few that are very important in terms of types of vulnerabilities, like SQL injection. Because remember, Oracle Business Suite runs as the apps account. If I find some security vulnerability in a customization in a standard Oracle page, it's running as the apps account. It can see all the data. There's no segregation of duties at the database level for the running application. So security vulnerabilities are very problematic in an Oracle Business Suite environment because there's no internal controls. Once there's a security vulnerability, it has full access to the entire application and database, depending on the exact extent of it. So when we talk about the process around DevSecOps in an Oracle Business Suite environment, we're talking about many different components and how do you do that. So all the way from how I'm actually just planning. Am I doing secure code training for my users? Do I actually have a secure architecture? Have I done any threat modeling? To actually writing the code. So do I have a very good secure development standard? Am I doing version control? Do I actually have security plugins like find sec bugs in Eclipse or whatever IDE for Java that the users are using? They may be using JDeveloper because they're doing OA framework extensions. Do I have the security tools within that to actually detect code when I'm writing the code versus having to find it later? During the build mode, I'm actually running static code analysis tools. During testing, actually, am I running tools called dynamic analysis or DAST that are actually trying to break the application? When I'm releasing code into production, actually, do I have the change control mechanisms in place to make sure that that code is moved into production, is being moved by who it should be, and developers don't have direct access to production code? Am I getting the appropriate release approvals? So again, these are all processes. So when you look at the overall development picture, these are the processes, and then you can dive into, for the different types of customizations, how this works. Because how I actually do like a concurrent manager program versus I may be running Apex. And I may have, which is Oracle Application Express, which provides a web front end to the database that then allows access to the Oracle Business Suite data. Is that on another server? Is that part of Oracle Business Suite? Because that code may be embedded in the Oracle eBusiness Suite database. And oh, by the way you develop that code is you actually go through a GUI and you can actually develop it live in the production system. You should be doing that test and development, moving it through change control. Is that process appropriate? So when you're talking about changes in Oracle Business Suite environment and the type of code, even some of these steps and processes may change based on the type of code and the type of customization being done. So when we talk about changes to an Oracle Business Suite environment and customizations, there's not just one type of customization. These are all the different types of customizations that can be done purely from a code perspective. There's even more customization that can be done from the application through the application itself. But this is kind of the code piece that you need to be looking at. And some of these can actually be updated in the application, like Oracle Alerts. It allows you to enter a SQL statement into the application. So again, customizations are even fairly difficult within Oracle Business Suite and what you need to look at. And then the other problem is there's multiple languages. So when you're starting to talk about how do you actually secure all these, you have to be thinking about that there's different languages going on. So I may have Java, I may have shell scripts running, I may have PL SQL, which ends up in database packages, I may just have pure SQL, things like that. And again, there's a lot of material here in the presentation. I'm just going to go through a few of the slides, but we've actually included many of the slides in the presentation that talk about all these different tools and actually walk through all those steps in detail and actually talk about some of the vulnerabilities. So I'm going to skip by these fairly quickly. Again, the way we use the framework within Integrigy is we're trying to make sure that we're covering everything. So when we see gaps that aren't being covered, we're actually developing that and adding it to our either AppSentry product or our AppDefend product to try to cover that gap within Oracle Business Suite. So one of the things that we ran into a lot with clients was just DevSecOps was not being handled appropriately because, again, their code scanning tools within the organization just can't handle Oracle Business Suite because they don't have full coverage of all the different languages and all the different types of customizations, or the code scanning tools in general, none of them know about Oracle Business Suite. So the way I do shell scripts for concurrent manager programs, I can echo out the password for the app's password in 2 seconds. It's very easy to do. And that's how we find a lot of developers getting access to production using the apps account, is they're just echoing out the password in a shell script. No tool on the planet can do that, but we added that into AppSentry code to look for that specific use case within Oracle Business Suite. So this uses a set of proprietary and open source scanning tools all together to get full coverage of the Oracle Business Suite. Change management, again, is a fairly significant topic. The slides are all included here. I'm going to skip by this so we can kind of cover one more area. And the final topic is around what we call anomaly and event management, or you can refer to this as log management. So Oracle Business Suite generates a lot of logs and a lot of information. So we published this out probably for the last about 12 years. We've had the Integrigy framework for Oracle Business Suite auditing, as well as database auditing in general. And so as you can see, there's database audits, there's application audits. So when we're talking about the database, and that may even change because depending on the version of the database, I may be using traditional auditing, I may be using unified auditing, I may be using a third-party tool like Imperva or Guardium. At the application layer, there's the sign-on audit, there's audit trails, there's page access tracking, there's a web application logs as part of WebLogic or Oracle Application Server. These are all in different locations. How to actually centralize all this. So it's very important is that I centralize it, but then also I'm alerting, reporting, and correlating on that information within the Oracle Business Suite. And so our framework, and again, this white paper is on our website, and then we walk through key events for the application. So how do I do logins and logoffs? What do I need to be capturing? Because remember, you're not only capturing at the database layer, you need to be capturing at the application layer and a little bit at the application server layer. Because again, all three layers are generating different log files, either putting in the database or on the operating system, and have events. I have login events to the application server in WebLogic. So I'm using the WebLogic account with the default password of welcome1 to log in. Am I capturing that? Who's potentially using that account? Because that is a privileged account, and I can make changes to the application that will allow me to compromise it at that point. Who's logging in as the apps account? Who's not the application? Am I capturing that there? Who's logging in as the sysadmin user? Am I capturing that there? And then we map, actually, in our framework, we map all these out to the different compliance standards to make sure that we've got full coverage. And then here's an example that we put in that talks about how to do this. And this is a case we're actually talking about doing it for multiple databases simultaneously, that for every single database in the organization, you should be capturing a set of common events. For certain compliance databases, capturing certain events around compliance, and then you may have unique requirements around per database. And if we take that and actually now do it to an Oracle Business Suite environment, so this is kind of how it would look in an Oracle Business Suite environment. The red boxes to the left are all the application traffic. So again, for Oracle Business Suite, this is somewhat difficult to do, but I can do it with unified auditing in the Oracle database or with third-party products like Imperva and Guardium, that I can actually now take all that apps traffic at the database layer and throw out 99.9% of it, because I don't care about that. I don't really care that the application, someone logged into the application front end and executed some transactions. What I really care about is that when the DBA is logged in by just logging in through SQL Developer, what SQL transactions did they execute? How about other users? How about all those other ad hoc users? Do I have a read-only account? What are all those other users doing connecting to my system? Do I need to capture that information, especially when they're doing changes, when they're executing data definition language, DDL, when they're actually creating objects and things like that. What are my DBAs doing? And is it possible to capture detailed information about who that actually is at the operating system layer? And there's other things I can do at the database auditing. So again, if you're thinking about this, and this is what we include in the framework, is throughout the cycle, how do I actually make this easier for myself? I can actually add in ticket numbers. So when the DBA logs into the database and does something, I can actually have them execute something that adds a ticket number to their session. And so then when I get my audit reports out of my database logging, I can actually see the ticket number on certain audit events. That becomes very powerful. So do you have this done completely front to back, top to bottom, on how actually you're managing these details? Because again, this is not just a check mark. This is, how do I do the process? When my apps DBA connects to the database, what are they doing in the database? And most organizations cannot answer that question. You can get it to the point where, yes, I'm auditing that apps user just for when it's an ad hoc user. And then I'm actually adding in that they have a process. So when they actually go in and do some direct table updates or something like that, that's audited. And I actually have the ticket number for it. So they have to have a ticket in order to do that in your ticketing system, your change management system. So then I can generate reports, because I'm centralizing the audit trail, to say, hey, this is, let's say we're creating a user. How am I auditing all that user creation? Because I want to know what users are created at the database layer. I also want to do it at the application layer too. But at the database layer, I want to be able to get a ticket number around that to know that, hey, this user, that creation of that user was actually authorized because there's a change ticket somewhere for it. In order to simplify this again, we notice there's a huge gap for most of our clients that they were not centralizing this audit trail at all. And therefore, what we're doing is actually centralizing it and then using our tool called AppSentry to actually consume all that data. This is a one-click setup. You basically just point it to Oracle Business Suite, and it consumes all the auditing and logging data that's configured. And then in the framework, we're giving you a recommended set of audits that you should turn on. And then we're presenting it to you in a usable fashion, mapping out, hey, here's all the things going on at the database layer, here's everything going on at the e-business suite layer, as well as here's all your change management information. So that becomes a very powerful tool. So that's the Integrigy Security Framework at a very high level. This presentation just wanted to give you an introduction to it, to understand how to look at the Oracle Business Suite a little bit differently, not just from a checklist perspective, but try to understand and dive into some of the issues in the application. So we'll be publishing out, a lot of this information is already on our website. What we're doing now is consolidating all that and putting into a consolidated framework that looks at Oracle Business Suite security at a holistic manner on a number of different areas, very in depth, and combining a lot of knowledge we've already published out. So I'll open it up to questions. If anyone has any questions, please enter them into the webinar feature. You can just answer the questions there. And we've gotten a couple already. So the first question is, for checking databases, we use DBSat, but tons of false positives. So DBSat is the Oracle Database Security Assessment Tool. And this is a free tool from Oracle where you can download it and have the DBAs run it, and it generates a very nice HTML report. There's a couple issues with it. One is it doesn't know anything about Oracle Business Suite. It's for a pure Oracle database. And therefore, a lot of the things in Oracle Business Suite, it throws up what we would call false positives, primarily because you can't do anything about an Oracle Business Suite. So there's a number of security settings that you can change and really lock down a standard Oracle database, but you can't do that with Oracle Business Suite. Unfortunately, we don't recommend DBSat. That's why we have AppSentry. So AppSentry is intended for Oracle Business Suite. So when we scan an Oracle database with AppSentry, it's scanning it as an Oracle Business Suite. So it takes the AppleSys account. So there's an account called AppleSys Pub. The default password is Pub. Oracle doesn't recommend you change it. You need to change that because it allows people access. But when we do our database password checks, we look at and handle AppleSys Pub differently than all the other accounts because the way you have to change the password is very different. Where if you just change a lot of the Oracle Business Suite database passwords, if you find a default password, you won't be able to change the password directly for Oracle Business Suite because you have to change it in the application as well as the database. Just doing an alter user identified by will change it, but it'll actually break the application in some cases. So actually the next question follows up on that. So how should we check the database passwords? Again, Oracle has a couple tools, one being DBSat. The DBA should also be running something called DBA users with def password. That's a view within the database that will look at a table that Oracle provides that has a list of about 1,000 different database accounts with one password each. DBSat will actually look at that information and try to tell you if you've got some default passwords in the database, which is probably one of the biggest areas we see as compromises of Oracle databases is compromising default passwords in the database. When we do database breach investigations, typically we find it relates back to a default password more often than not. So probably at least 50, 60, 70% of our breach investigations, at some point a default password was involved in the process, and we can discover that forensically because we know which accounts were, they have at least some auditing turned on, we can see what happened. So those are tools that should be running DBA users with def password. The DBA should be running that on a periodic basis to see that there's no default passwords, but those are limited. So that's why like our AppSentry tool will look at about 2 million passwords per account. And oh, by the way, you can check them in 7 seconds. So what it does is it downloads the password hashes from the database into the tool, then offline cracks them using both permutations as well as data dictionaries of common passwords. And what's amazing with an Oracle database is each account, we can check 2 million different passwords within 7 seconds. So it's very quick to operate. But again, it's checking every single account with 2 million passwords for each account, where the Oracle tools will check a limited set of about 1,000 accounts, which includes most of the Oracle Business Suite accounts, but not all. So even Oracle's list doesn't include all the Oracle Business Suite accounts, but only checks them against one or maybe a few accounts have 2 passwords each. So it's a very limited check. So when we run it against AppSentry versus DBA users with def passwords, we find oftentimes many more default passwords than the organization is familiar with. I think we have time for one more question here. So the final question is, our DBAs won't enable database auditing because it causes performance problems. If we look at a database and we see that database auditing is not enabled, that's generally almost always the answer. Oh, the DBAs won't do it because it causes too much of a performance problem, or we turned on a massive amount of auditing 5 years or 10 years ago and it caused a performance problem, so no one's willing to do that again. And the answer to that question is yes, database auditing will cause a performance problem if it's not done right. So if you look at the Integrigy Framework for Oracle Business Suite auditing, we're very specific about what we're auditing. We're not auditing everything. So if we go back to the auditing slide, we do a select group of events to audit. As you can see, not every audit's on here. We avoid transaction auditing as much as possible. If you have to do transaction auditing, that's when you have to be very, very careful. Think about it very thoroughly. Calculate how many updates, how many changes, how many reads are to those tables, and how many audit records that's going to generate per day. So if you look at this list for a database auditing, the logins and logoffs will have the most audits. And generally, those are around 10,000 a day is typically what we see. Sometimes they'll be on a really large database, maybe 50,000 a day, but they're not that many. And the rest of these, you can actually typically count into the hundreds or less. Many of these, like user creation, you're only creating a couple of users a month. Even if you're even creating a couple a month, that's rare. So there's really not that many changes. Some of the object creation will create a little bit more, but again, that's typically around a patching cycle. So I'm typically having downtime, so it's not impacting the database running for end users typically. So you're not seeing a lot. So the auditing must be carefully designed. We've got a very good recommendation out there, at least for a starting point. And then spend your time is like, yes, we need to audit that. Or, hey, at the application level, let's do all user creation, all responsibility creation, all functions and menu changes. But if I'm going to do every single time someone accesses national identifier and P or all people F table, that's not going to work. Then your other problem is that's not going to give you useful data anyways, because everything's happening as the apps account behind the scenes. So it's a little bit more difficult to get down to the end user who queried that data. In some cases with things like you're running 19C of the database, you can use unified auditing, and I can see potentially if my named ad hoc users are actually using that. I'd never want to turn on a very rigorous audit on the apps account doing a transactional table, like every single access to PRL people have, because it'll just generate millions of audit records per day, which are just worthless because often I won't even see who the end user is. All I'll see is the apps user using it. So if you're going to do database auditing, we've got a very good recommendation on the baseline, and then be very careful because it can cause a performance problem. But if you do it right, it will never cause a performance problem and have very minimal impact to the overall database, like less than 1% CPU utilization. So that was the questions we had. Thank you everyone for attending today. And our next webinar will probably be coming up in July timeframe, and we'll let you know what it is. So again, everyone have a great rest of your day, and thank you for attending.